Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Last week, AJC released its 2022 survey on anti-Semitism in France. The troubling results reveal the extent of unabated anti-Semitism threatening the country's Jewish population, the largest in Europe. Joining us today to examine the survey results and what they mean for efforts to combat anti-Semitism are AJC Paris Director Anne-Sophie Sebban-Bécache and AJC Europe Managing Director Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. Moderating today's conversation is AJC Chief Advocacy Officer Belle Yoeli. After we hear from Anne-Sophie, Simone, and Belle, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Belle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire, and good day, everyone. Simone and Anne-Sophie, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss these recent surveys. It's great to be with you as always. And I know our audience is eager to learn from you, so I'm going to jump right in. Simone, AJC has been conducting surveys in France for, I believe, the past 8 years, but I understand that this one is quite large and unprecedented. What is different about this survey, and why is this so significant?
First of all, thank you very much for having us. This is indeed an unprecedented survey. For the past 8 years, we've done those surveys mostly because we saw the phenomenon of anti-Semitism rise basically since the early years of 2000. But the only thing that we really had was basically hate crime numbers, the numbers from the Ministry of Interior. And we understood that there was more to it. So that was the reason why we started the surveys. We started out by looking into the prejudice that exists in French society about Jews, about, typical stereotypical ideas about Jews having too much power, Zionist conspiracies, etc., etc. And we tried to test those. In 2019, for the first time, we also looked at another aspect of it. We looked at the experience of French Jews of anti-Semitism and what they thought about the experience that they were having. And so this time around, we did the whole thing. It's 360 degrees long. It looks at all angles of anti-Semitism. It's also the largest sample. So we looked both at the general population of sort of French people about their prejudice of anti-Semitism, what they thought about anti-Semitism and whether it's increased. And we had looked at the same time also at a specific population, which is French Muslims, because this is something that we've had to experience, unfortunately, in the past, that we saw that in particular, this population had more anti-Semitic prejudice as well. So we wanted to test that as well. And then we looked at French Jews and their experience. What you need to understand is that this is, particularly in the French context where ethnical statistics are forbidden, pretty unprecedented. So, the French Ministry of Interior, the French government never looks at who does what. We all sort of French people in general. So to actually look at, the nitty-gritty detail of the experience of anti-Semitism is very unprecedented indeed.
Thank you so much, Simone. And Anne-Sophie, let me ask you to add a little more context for us, adding to what Simone just said. Share with our audience, what are some of the most important findings from the survey?
Sure, thank you, Belle. It's good to be with you today. So the main observation we made out of the results is the general awareness in France that anti-Semitism is an important problem for the country and that it's a growing one. More importantly, there is a general awareness, it's 73% of the French respondents, that this is not the problem of the Jews, but the one of the French society as a whole. Now, on a slightly different note, our survey shows that anti-Semitic prejudices are high, persistent, and deeply encouraged in society, because it's actually from a fourth to 1/3 of French who agreed on almost all the prejudices, the anti-Semitic prejudices that we have tested, from believing that Jews have too much power in economy and finance, in the medias, in the politics. And what we see as well is that the level of prejudice is even higher when we look at 4 subgroups of the general population. So there's the extreme right, the extreme left, the anti-vax supporters, and most importantly, the Muslim respondents. Moreover, the survey tells us about the French perception, the root of anti-Semitism. So we observe that what comes first is the hate of Israel, then comes the Islamist ideology, then conspiracy theories, and then comes the extreme right and extreme left ideologies. Now, on the other aspect, Simone mentioned the French Jews sample that we also polled. The survey allows us to better understand the reality of anti-Semitism for French Jews. So 74% of them have already experienced an anti-Semitic incident at least once in their life. It tells us also about the geography of anti-Semitism, if I can put it that way, meaning that we observe that schools are the first place where French Jews have experienced anti-Semitism, and social medias are actually the first place of observation of anti-Semitic behavior by the larger French population. And most of all, and I will stop with this last finding, the survey tells us about the French Jews' new and constrained behaviors because of anti-Semitism. For instance, 55% of Jewish parents ask their children not to wear a visible sign of their Jewish identity, and 45% of them ask their children not to say that they are Jewish.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. And it's interesting because I feel on the one hand we get this result that everyone is aware of the anti-Semitism problem and that it's not just a Jewish problem, right? It's a French problem, but at the same time, these numbers are very alarming for the French Jewish community. And Anne-Sophie, let me follow up with a follow-up question to you. What do these results mean for the future of Jewish life in France? What are the immediate consequences?
Well, the immediate consequences are the feeling of insecurity. And if we look deeper in the details, we observe that, for instance, the wearing of distinctive signs appear as the main risk factor associated with the attacks. 70% of the French Jewish respondents wearing distinctive signs have already been insulted. And we have to recall that when we speak about visible sign, it's not only the kippas, it's putting a mezuzah on the front door. It's also wearing a David star on the neck, and therefore the feeling of insecurity is very high, and it's in the daily life of French Jews. As I said earlier before, the French Jews integrate strategies of dissimulation and avoidance. 30% of French Jews declare that they avoid, say, certain neighborhoods, avoid wearing visible sign. And it's clear that the risk associated with wearing distinctive sign, for instance, is accepted by French Jews. And I can give you a very, very concrete example. In 2016, after a Jewish teacher was attacked in the street in Marseille, and he was wearing a kippah, the head of the president of the city's community called on the believers to stop wearing the kippah until better days. And furthermore, more than a third of French Jews declare that they avoid saying that they're Jewish. And as I said, this number is even higher for French Jews wearing visible sign. And I mean, to put in a nutshell, this leads us to a quite depressing conclusion. That because of the experience of anti-Semitism, which is widely shared by French Jews, and of the fear of anti-Semitism, Jews are living a constrained and different daily life from the rest of the French population.
Yes, indeed. That's obviously very concerning to hear. Simone, let me ask you also, feel free to chime in on your thoughts of what are the immediate consequences of this. But I also want to ask you, in addition to that, I know you've worked on this issue for a long time, and we've seen kind of an evolution of the awareness in France around this issue. I'm curious for your thoughts on what's caused that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. No, I think what Anne-Sophie just said is absolutely right. Of course it is. French Jews have integrated a reality that somehow has become normal, but it's a parallel life. It's not the same life as any other French person lives. When you take your kids to school, you tell them, don't say that you're Jewish because there is an increased risk that they are facing violence. When you're going to synagogue, you ask yourself whether you're going to put a kippah on your head because there's a risk of violence. So they have really integrated this reality, and that's a very concrete impact that basically has an impact on the mindset of French Jews, and we can talk about the mindset later, but that's absolutely crucial. On the other hand, you say there is a paradox. French society has, which I don't think has been the case 10 years ago, has become more and more aware of the fact that anti-Semitism is a problem in society, and that it's not only a problem for a tiny minority. Yes, France's Jewish community is the largest one in Europe, but it's still less than 1% of the entire population. There are between 450 and 600,000 Jews in France. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. But they understand that at the end of the day, anti-Semitism is to some extent the canary in the coal mine, that it's the beginning of something, and that at the end of the day, it's fundamentally contradictory with French and European values. So that's a good thing. And I think part of it has to do with the work that AJC has been doing for many, many years, because it's a message that we have been conveying for really decades, really. And at the same time, I think it's a message that we have managed to convey to most political leaders. So, Manuel Valls, for example, the former prime minister, who's a very dear friend, has really taken a lead and really said consistently that anti-Semitism is a problem for society, that France without its Jews wouldn't be France anymore, that the essence of France, of the Republic, is its Jewish population. So I think that's a message that we have managed to convey. The question then is that unfortunately the reality hasn't changed, meaning that despite the efforts of the French government, of the successive French governments, it hasn't had a sufficient impact. So there are obviously questions for us as an advocacy organization. Basically is, yes, the French government is doing a lot. Yes, there's a plan in place. Yes, they have adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism, but is it enough? Because apparently it hasn't had a sufficient important impact on simply Jewish life in France.
Right, it's so confusing. And Sophie, let me ask you, you're a young French Jew living in France. Obviously, you work with young French Jews every day. You both do. What is the feeling in terms of the future for Jewish life? You have this awareness, and yet nothing is changing. Do we see French Jews continuing toward the pattern of moving to Israel, making Aliyah, as was so high, several years ago? Do we see that continuing? Do we see French Jews fighting for their place in the country and wanting to stay and hold out for better conditions for the Jewish population?
Sure. So as we said earlier, because school appears to be the first place of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic exposure, it also means that young Jews, that the Jewish youth is the most exposed to the phenomenon in comparison to the rest of the group. And this was one of the most striking results in 2019, and this is still proved this year. And further on, if we go further on, we also know that on several items, this anti-Semitic experience is much more pronounced among families whose children are enrolled in private school. And this is very important, because this reflects a failure for what we call the French Republican school, because we know that this feeling of insecurity pre-existed the choice of schooling young Jews to private schools. And the core mission of the French Republican school is not only to protect all the children, but also to allow citizens of all faiths to make a nation. And this is what is, I would say, the prayer for young Jews today is that this phenomenon is participating to somehow a disintegration of French Jewry more largely, I would say. There is another phenomenon that we don't measure in our survey, but which is well documented, is what we call the internal aliyah. Before we speak about general aliyah, it's the phenomenon where we see French Jews moving from some places in France, some cities to other ones, some neighborhoods of Paris to other ones because of fear of anti-Semitism. And the result is that we have French Jews that are slowly regrouping geographically. And fear is that on the long run, this will have a very sad impact on the French Jewry and on the young Jews, various colors and cultural richness and diversity. And, you know, we often recall the treasures which French Jewry, the French society as a whole. But if young Jews are not studying anymore with the rest of the population, if they are not living anymore in contact with the rest of the population, I think that slowly, this will impoverish French Jewry and what it can bring and what it has always brought to French society at large. Now, does it impact the young Jews who wants to leave France? We have measured it. The positive aspect is that when we poll the reason why French Jews decide to leave France, what we observe is a positive evolution in comparison to previous years. The fear of anti-Semitism has weakened, and there are more religious, cultural, ideological reasons that are motivating the choice of departure. And generally speaking, the rate of French Jews who consider leaving France has also decreased in comparison to 2019, but there are many reasons to explain it. Also, like COVID can explain it because the borders were closed for quite a while. But what is sure, I mean, to conclude, my main fear is that it will impoverish what can the young French Jews and French Jewry at large can bring to the French society if we continue that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Simone, feel free to add in terms of your predictions for the future of French Jews and French society. I know that's difficult, but I'm sure others.
I've had predictions for many years.
But go ahead, we can start there. Go ahead.
No, listen, I mean, I think what we have to understand is that anti-Semitism has started in France, or this new form of anti-Semitism, this new wave of anti-Semitism, really 20 years ago. So we have an entire generation of young people who only know that reality. So that obviously has an impact. It has an impact of young Jewish state of mind, of how people project themselves in the future, of the questions they ask themselves to their contribution to society, about whether or not they are, responsible parents when, once they have kids, to raise their children in France. And again, I think the issue is that the problem, the consequences have not disappeared. There is action, but it's not sufficient to eliminate the problem. And so I think that definitely poses some very serious questions as to the future of French Jewry here. I mean, let's be very clear. It's still very vibrant. There are still many Jews. There are synagogues. There is cultural life. We have radio stations. We have kosher food. We have everything. But I think it has a strong impact on the Jewish mind, and in particular on young people's minds. And when I look now to the United States, that obviously gives me a lot of fear, because I now see also on American college campuses, young American Jews being faced with exactly the same kind of phenomenon, with anti-Semitism. We have done surveys in the United States as well, where we also see the state of mind changing, growing awareness of anti-Semitism, people hiding their Jewishness, not being Jewish and proud anymore. And I think, the longer the problem persists, the bigger of an impact it has, and the more normal this reality becomes, which shouldn't be normal at all.
Yeah, I'm continuously startled by what you're saying, and it's also difficult because these dual realities, I think, are very hard to grapple with. Simone, I want to ask you, following up on another kind of tough question related to the surveys, and that's one of the most, I think, startling findings, but also one of the more difficult ones to talk about, is the level of anti-Semitism found amongst Muslims living in France. And so, frame for our audience, obviously we at AJC talk about how anti-Semitism comes from multiple sources and it looks different in every place in the world. But in this context, talk to our audience, why did you decide to survey this specific population, and what more specifically did you find?
Sure. So when anti-Semitism started first in the early 2000s, we saw an increase of anti-Semitism linked mostly to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the Second Intifada. And we saw some of the perpetrators. And again, you have to understand, in the French Republic, we don't speak about, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, everybody is the same. But we saw something that was happening. In 2004, the French government asked for a report on anti-Semitism. And the then reporter for the French government, the rapporteur, Jean-Christophe Ruffin, noted that the far-right involvement in anti-Semitic acts was decreasing in France, while a minority of young people from what he called immigrant background were increasingly responsible for anti-Semitic violence. And so that was basically the hypothesis. The reality was, because of the French Republican model, we wouldn't speak about it. So we would never speak about Islamist anti-Semitism. We wouldn't, of course, not speak about Muslim anti-Semitism, immigrant background, et cetera, et cetera. So, but sort of the reporter had said it, and we wanted to test it. We wanted to test all of the hypotheses. We knew that there were different forms of anti-Semitism from the far right, from the far left, from within the Muslim community, but we never really tested it. So that's basically what we try to do. It's a difficult issue to address, of course, because let's be clear, the Muslim population in France represents about 10% of the overall French population. There is, of course, the issue of racism. Without a doubt, it's a minority that is facing racism. Without a doubt, it's a minority that is facing also discrimination. So to sort of wrap your head around the idea that a minority that itself is suffering from racism and discrimination could potentially itself have within its midst people who are anti-Jewish racist was a difficult concept to understand and also to admit. So that's why we wanted to test it. And unfortunately, it's true that it is this particular group that has the highest degree of anti-Semitic stereotypes amongst all of the groups that we tested. So I'll give you an example. While 26% of French people in general agree with the statement that Jews have too much power in the field of economics and finance, which, by the way, is already far too high. 51% of Muslims, for example, agree with this statement. So it's nearly double. Our approach was basically to say we have to have a conversation about this. We need to understand exactly where it's coming from if we want to fight it. You can only fight a problem if you understand where it's coming from. The same way, white supremacy, you have to understand how it functions, what the stereotypes is, what the networks are, how it works in order to fight it. So this is why we did it. What we found, nevertheless, was, and this is really the first time that we found it here, is that there is some hope, because we see that the new generation, the younger people, are less anti-Semitic on a certain number of stereotypes than the older generation. So, for example, while 60% of Muslims of 50 years and over say that Jews hold too much power in the media, those that agree with his statement are only about 40%. So it's a 20-point gap, which is nevertheless considerable. So we see that there is nevertheless that something that is happening with the new generation. We'll have to push it further. We'll have to analyze it further, whether it's school, whether it's their exposure to other communities, whether it's the kind of work that AJC has been doing, because we've been reaching out a lot to young people, and particularly young people from within the Muslim community. Is it that is having an impact? The second thing that we have seen is that there is a discrepancy between people who are going to the mosque a lot and practicing Islam versus those who go less to the mosque or practicing Islam not at all. And so it's more or less, the more you go to the mosque, the higher degree of anti-Semitism you have. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means. This is, again, something that has to be analyzed. Is it because what people hear in the mosque is because mosques are not sufficiently well controlled in France? Is it because of foreign influence of other countries? All of this has to be analyzed, of course, but it gives, I think, us some leads as to how to address the problem. And again, I'm convinced that the only way of finding a solution and addressing the problem is by actually talking about it and trying to analyze it as, as honestly as possible. And by the way, we have incredibly productive conversation with partners from within the Muslim community in order to address the problem of anti-Semitism.
Thank you for that very thorough and helpful information, Simone. And I like that you mentioned that there's hope, right? And you said it well, that AJC is doing this work every day, is well positioned to continue this conversation. And it's nice to know that there is room to build. And I think we all agree that having this data is a key step in moving forward. Anne-Sophie, I want to come back to something you said earlier, which is, I think, related to this as well, that Israel-related anti-Semitism is seen by all survey groups as the #1 cause of anti-Semitism. So that's known. But at the same time, that it seems that this kind of anti-Semitism doesn't seem to be fully understood. They acknowledge that it's there, but the link between the Israel piece and the anti-Semitism piece is not exactly clear. Can you speak to that dynamic?
Sure, absolutely. And this is actually, for me, one of the most interesting findings of the study. But first of all, I think there is a precaution to be taken when we read these results. And this is to say that the reality of anti-Semitism in general is particularly complex to grasp, to understand. As French Rabbi Delphine Villers explains, unlike racism, anti-Semitism is more a matter of inferiority complex than of a superiority complex. We hate Jews because we project that they have an additional power that we don't have. Also, like contrary to other types of racism, we hate Jews not because they are different from us, but because they are at the same time singular and totally similar to us. Anti-Semites would say invisible. And so this is just to understand the basic reasoning behind traditional anti-Semitism. Now it's even more complicated, I think, when it comes to Israel-related hatred. We bring into play a state, the double Jewish identity of belonging both to religion and to a nation. And we also bring into play the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the conflict which is of low intensity, but very eruptive, especially in France, very passionate, and especially in France. So all of this, I think, explains in part the result that you cite, the fact, for example, that we find as many French people considering that accusing Jews of being responsible for Israel's policies is a legitimate critique, and as many who consider this as being anti-Semitic, and as many French people who actually don't know. And this is showing a great difficulty in identifying these prejudices, or even a total lack of understanding on the issue. And to sum it up, what our survey shows on these prejudices, but also on the other one, is that there is a general awareness that anti-Semitism is a problem. We said it, that this is a problem of the whole society, but there is difficulty in identifying anti-Semitism itself and anti-Semites. And this is why on this specific issue of Israel-related hatred, this is why we have, and we recall in our advocacy work, the campaign we led for the adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism. This is why it was, and the survey shows that we really must now go further and make sure that this is concretely helping for a better understanding and a better identification of this specific type of anti-Semitism. As you said, French people now understand that this is probably the first cause of anti-Semitism, the hatred of Israel. But when it comes to understand that the prejudices that are behind it, it's much more difficult. And now we have to make sure that a greater majority of French people are able to identify this new type of anti-Semitism.
It's really, really fascinating. Oh, Simone, do you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to say, I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, our Translate Hate is so important. And we did something similar in France called mot pour mot, where I think it's easy, for people to understand that when you say, I don't know, Jews drink the blood of children is anti-Semitic. The phenomenon of anti-Semitism changes its face, and it has changed its face throughout centuries. And so the difficulty, I think, today is that people understand that there is something wrong, that there is an Israel-related anti-Semitism, but then when you actually try and ask them to identify how it expresses itself, and if they're capable of recognizing it, they're just not. And so I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done. Of course, the working definition is a very important tool, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in explaining to people as how the face of anti-Semitism has changed. It's not enough to just say, Israel-related anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism hides itself behind anti-Zionism. I think there needs to be done much more in order to explain to people how it manifests itself.
I think that's absolutely right. And let me just add that for anyone who's watching who might not know, Translate Hate is our glossary, which can be found online, that helps to try to explain anti-Semitic terms and tropes. And as Simone said, we believe at AJC that to fight anti-Semitism, you have to understand it. So if you'd like to see it, you can go to ajc.org/translate-hate. It's right there on our website, and it's very helpful. I want to, before turning it over to audience questions, I want to zoom out for a moment, because obviously when you do a survey, there are things happening in society. Not everyone is focusing solely on anti-Semitism all the time, even though it's our primary focus. And this survey happened in the middle of a presidential campaign. So Simone, let me ask you first, set the stage for us in terms of what does this campaign looked like, and perhaps the larger, geopolitical implications for what's happening in Europe. And then Anne-Sophie, perhaps you can comment on if the issue of anti-Semitism has played a role during the campaign.
So yeah, it's a very, very complicated campaign. Emmanuel Macron has had a very difficult presidency. And we see what we have already witnessed for several years, not only in France, but I would say across liberal democracies, a sort of anti-system movement where traditional parties are falling apart. In France, used to have, just as in the United States, mainly two parties, the left and the right, the Socialist and the Republican Party. They have basically fallen apart. So in the last presidential election, we had Emmanuel Macron, who basically came from nowhere. He created his own party and became president. This time around, it's more or less the same trend going through. So we see candidates who are anti-system candidates. We have, of course, the far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen, but we also have candidates who, like, for example, Eric Zemmour, some of you might have read extensively about him, who's basically a journalist. He doesn't have a party. He's also in the right, far right sphere, and who suddenly appeared on the scene and is polling, frankly, in a very, very short period, very, very high. So we are seeing a sort of a disintegration of the political party system, a polarization of the political party system that is happening, and that can frankly produce all sorts of results. Again, you've had in the United States also untypical candidates that have been elected as well. We've seen it across other democracies. So it's a complicated period with a very loud and noisy campaign, where mostly the issues of immigration, Islamism, security have become an issue, and all of this happening in a geopolitical environment where, we're talking about Russia potentially invading Ukraine. We're talking about democracies within the European Union, becoming less and less, more and more illiberal. So yeah, I would say it's a challenging environment for the country and for the European at large. And all of this happening at a time where France is holding the EU presidency, if I may say so.
Yeah, if I can maybe add on the French presidential elections and actually around in the context of the release of our survey, what we observed before we released the survey, as we were finalizing the questionnaire, there was this big affair around Éric Zemmour, as Simone mentioned, all the declarations he made about the Vichy regime, about the Jewish children that were killed in Toulouse, about the Dreyfus affair, brought the anti-Semitism at the heart of the public debate. It was very disturbing because, as Simone said, he's an extreme right polemist and he's also Jewish, so very disturbing for the French Jewish community and for the French society at large. On another note, but not less disturbing, we have the other extreme right candidate, Marine Le Pen, been trying for the last past to distance herself from the anti-Semitic pattern of the party and her father's all declaration about Jews, etc. And when we released the survey, actually, we observed a great interest from all candidates, and we've been very cautious because we're a non-partisan organization. But several candidates showed interest in reacting to the survey, or even like candidates teams reach out for us to share our recommendations on the issue, because they know that this topic is unavoidable. And we know that after a few weeks after our release, the topic will come back at the heart of the public debate in March. For instance, sadly, we will commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Toulouse attack, and the candidates will express themselves. We know that President Macron will travel to Toulouse, and they'll have to be to show that they are accountable on the issue. I think that what we wanted to do with our survey is to oblige to make sure that during the presidential campaign, anti-Semitism will be addressed. And what we see is that in any case, it's addressed, but now we oblige the public debate to go a little bit further than the usual expected declarations on the matter, because we show that it's not an issue of French Jews, but of the whole society. And I think it's the most impactful consequence of the findings of the survey.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question, and then we can turn it over to Claire for audience Q&A. The survey points to, and you've referenced it, and also we talk a lot about AJC, the role of social networks, right, as part of this conversation, in the prominence of hate, the disseminating of hate, and that we're trying to battle this around the world. And I know it's particularly important in the French context. What steps has France taken to combat hate speech online, and perhaps what are you currently discussing with the government in terms of what else could be done? I know, Simone, if you want to start, and Anne-Sophie, you can chime in.
Sure. As you said, the issue of hate speech is a clear and difficult issue for us to address. We have seen in the survey that the social media is really one of the places where both Jews experience anti-Semitism amongst the most of the places, and as well as non-Jews witness anti-Semitism the most. The French government is extremely committed in addressing the issue. They have done numerous laws in order to create a framework under which social media companies have to behave. You have to understand that in the French and European context, we don't have the First Amendment, so we have already laws that exist where freedom of speech to some extent is regulated whenever it transforms itself into hate speech. So basically the overall idea, the overall philosophy is to say that basically whatever is illegal in real life should be illegal in the virtual sphere. And so this is really something that the French government has been very active on doing. They have obliged, there was recently a lawsuit between the Union of Jewish Students and Twitter, for example, where the courts have ruled that Twitter is now obliged to be much more transparent as to the way they deal with hate speech on their platform. They have to reveal, for example, the fact that how they moderate the hate speech online, where their moderators are based on, etc., etc. So the courts and the governments are extremely committed in dealing with the issue, and now it will be becoming an issue also on the European level, because the French hold the EU presidency, and maybe Anne-Sophie can speak about this as well. There will be something called the Digital Service Act that will be coming in front of the European Union, that has the objective of regulating really hate speech online. The overall philosophy, once again, is that you can't leave the regulation only in the hands of social media companies, basically private companies. There needs to be some sort of framework under which we all operate on.
Anne-Sophie, do you want to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe one or two, just 2 points, because Simone said it all, but maybe two concrete examples where we've seen progress in France. One is, when during the first or second lockdown, I don't remember, there was big anti-Semitic attacks against Miss Provence, a French Franco-Israeli Miss, and a few months later, there was a concrete condemnation of the authors of I think 7 of the authors of anti-Semitic attacks against her online. And this, I think this is creating a precedent, like there can be condemnation and this idea of, making sure that there is no impunity online, and this is progressing. So I think we have to underline it, and this is not much, but it's going the right direction. And one other aspect was part of the Digital Services Act. There was also this French law, which was very much criticized on Islamist separatism, on reinforcing. This is the name of reinforcing the Republican values. And one of the aspects was also to bring more control on the platforms. And this was this law was also, debated in the aftermath of the terrorist attack on Samuel Paty, the history teacher, because we knew that the terrorists who attacked him, took information about him and his address and his agenda online, and so this law has created more controls and more condemnation when there are exposure of private information online that leading to concrete crimes. And this was also a major, I think, step forward.
Thank you for adding that. And with that, Claire, I'm going to turn it over to you. I can see we have a lot of questions coming in. Go ahead.
Thanks, Belle. Our first question comes from AJC leader Janice Allen, who's asking, the survey shows that 72% of all French citizens believe anti-Semitism is not only a Jewish problem. What types of behavioral changes or advocacy actions do you see from your intergroup and interreligious partners? Are they seeing the results as a call to action? Simone, we'll start with you.
Yes, first of all, we always have a tendency to be, depressed and pessimistic, especially as I'm an Ashkenazi. But the reality is, when I look at the evolution over the past 20 years, and I've been at this over the past 20 years, things have changed. Our partners are becoming more and more courageous. Let's be very clear, we did this survey for the 5th time with a non-Jewish foundation. It's one of the biggest political foundations in France. It's a think tank. They do things from, renewable energy to whatever finance, the issue of anti-Semitism is absolutely key. It's the number one issue they have dealt with in all of their reports. So we can really see that we have more and more partners, non-Jewish partners, who see this as a fundamental issue, as a fundamental threat to what France is actually about. And I think also on some of the Muslim partners that we've been working with, we see more and more voices. We see more and more voices of young Muslim leaders who see anti-Semitism as a threat to the values that they cherish, as a threat to themselves, because they understand that it comes from the same space that actually threatens them. One of the things that, by the way, we saw in our survey, that we saw that 20% of Muslims consider Islamism as one of the principal causes of anti-Semitism, which means that there are 20% of Muslims who understand that the same thing that threatens Jews is threatening them and is threatening society as a whole. So yes, I think we have seen progress. The question, once again, and I've said it before, is politically, do we put in sufficient means in order to deal with a problem that is growing and that has been growing for 20 years? Maybe if we had used the means that we are using now 20 years ago, we would have solved the problem. But the problem is that the problem has become bigger, and so the means have to become bigger. That we put there in order to deal with the issue. So the question is really, how much of a priority is this for the French government, and what are they willing to put in place in order to deal with the problem that is only growing?
Thank you. Yeah. Our next question comes from Max in London, who's asking, how does France's particular brand of secularism and national identity impact not only these results, but also how you combat anti-Semitism? And Anne-Sophie, we'll start with you.
So I answered to maybe the last part of the question, and also I just wanted to go back to the previous one for one minute, because and it answers this question, because what I wanted to say is that this year we went a little bit further than in 2019, when we asked the general population if they think that anti-Semitism is the problem of the Jews or the problem of the whole French society. So this 72% is very important. It shows the awareness, but then we also ask questions about the political actions to combat anti-Semitism. We asked, for instance, the fact that the Ministry of Interior forbid the protests that were supposed to take place, the pro-Palestinian protests that were supposed to take place last May, because of fear of anti-Semitic incidents. The protests were banned. And we see that the vast majority of French people agreed on that decision. On another topic, you've all heard probably about the Sarah Halimi case. We know that it was a huge shock for the French Jews, but we polled the French general population, and this is a positive sign as well. We realized that it didn't only shock the Jewish population, but the French society at large. The vast majority of French people said that they didn't understand and disagree on that decision. So for me, this is showing that it actually creates. I think this can have a great impact, not only on the conversation and on our work, because it creates a political and moral obligation for the French authorities. It means that the public action and the means to combat anti-Semitism should not only match the pace of the phenomenon, we know the pace of the phenomenon, but it also has to match the French people as the French concern and the French awareness to combat the phenomenon with firmer actions and more efficient actions in terms of security, in terms of justice, and consequently, I think it sets our work in a more central position for the French government. And we could see it in the reaction after the release of our survey, because it also means that our advocacy doesn't only address a minority group issue, but a phenomenon which is deeply anchored in the French society, and which is considered by French society as a threat to its values, and that should be combated as such. And I think this is where we can really have an impact, as Simone said, on the means that will be dedicated to the fight against antisemitism. The means and the budget, to speak very concretely, should really be increased to if we want to make sure that we combat this phenomenon on the long run and more effectively.
Thanks. Many on Zoom are asking, what, if there is, what's the connection between the anti-vax movement and anti-Semitism? And Simone, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, sure. We asked, so first of all, what you have to understand is that in real life, we have seen the manifestation of anti-Semitism a lot through the different demonstrations, the anti-vax demonstrations that were happening across the country, just as we've seen it elsewhere. Comparisons with the Holocaust, people who were wearing the trivialization of the Holocaust, people who are wearing yellow stars, but also conspiracy theories, where one of the big themes, for example, during some of those protests, were people holding up signs who said who meaning who is behind COVID, who is controlling the media, who. And obviously that was a direct anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, basically saying that Jews were behind everything. So we saw this really in real life. We saw it a lot on social media. So that's one of the reasons why we asked people, and in particular those who have sympathy for the anti-vax movement, whether a certain number of questions. So we clearly saw that those who have sympathy for the anti-vax movement have a higher degree of anti-Semitism on issues like, again, Jews have too much influence in media, Jews have too much influence in finance and economics, where you see a higher degree of anti-Semitism. It's not entirely surprising. Again, of course, not every anti-vaxxer means that he's an anti-Semite or he or she is an anti-Semite. Of course not. But it's nevertheless a movement, and you could see this in these demonstrations, where different sort of extremist groups are coming together. You could see people from the far right, people from the far left, sort of anti-political, anti-system movements coming together. And we saw, and usually these kind of movements go hand in hand with an increase of anti-Semitism. So we saw similar things happening, for example, with the Yellow Vest movement, that originally was a movement against, high prices in France, etc., and that turned into sort of a conspiratorial anti-system movement, where we'd also have, sort of anti-Semitic stereotypes coming with this. Again, Anne-Sophie mentioned this earlier on, anti-Semitism differentiate itself from racism in the fact that people believe that, that Black people, that Arabs, that whatever, other minorities are inferior. With anti-Semitism, it's exactly the opposite. People believe that they are this invisible hand that is somehow controlling things. And that goes very well with this sort of anti-political, anti-system movement that we could see in the anti-vax movement, but also in the Yellow Vest movement.
Thank you. And our last question comes from David Ginsburg, who's asking, following up about the presidential elections, how might they change the current situation, particularly if Macron gets reelected or not? Anne-Sophie, I'll start with you.
Well, if Macron is reelected, I would say that the first thing that we will expect from him will be the release of the next action plan to fight against racism and anti-Semitism. Actually, every 2 years there is a new plan with new measures, with new actions put in place, and the next one was supposed to be released like a few months ago. So we are running after the governmental bodies who are in charge of it, and it seems like they've postponed the release of this new plan to the elections. So on one hand, this is a little bit worrying, because if President Macron is not reelected, like where this will lead to, we don't really know. This is not a very positive sign on the role that will be attributed to the DILCRA, which is this interministerial body in charge of the fight against racism and anti-Semitism. And if he's reelected, the fact that we are waiting so much has increased our expectations. So we really hope that it will, that the new plan will include maybe some of the recommendations we've made a few months ago, and the ones that are coming out from the main findings of our survey.
Simone, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe if I can. Obviously, if Marine Le Pen wins, or if Eric Zemmour wins, that's going to be a total game changer. And it's difficult to predict whenever anything could happen, because we've never had a far-right government. So that is obviously could potentially have an impact. I mean, I think what has been reassuring for French Jews for a very long time has been the fact that, yes, the situation on the ground is difficult. Yes, there is anti-Semitism, from the streets, but we are not in the situation as we used to be in the 30s, where there was institutional anti-Semitism. To the contrary, we have always had, since the Second World War, the support of numerous French governments in fighting anti-Semitism. So obviously that would be entirely different, because we don't know what that would mean. Maybe two other points. The one thing that I think there is a disconnect sometimes with the French government and and different French governments is not necessarily connecting the dots between the issue of anti-Semitism and their policy on Israel. Now, bilateral relations between France and Israel are very good. But there is always the voting pattern of the French government, for example, in international institutions, has not always been very positive. The relative cautiousness about how the relationship is being portrayed has always been a little complicated. So I would hope that at some point that will change. Because obviously that also contributes. And the other thing that I would hope would change is more education about what we spoke earlier about this new form of anti-Semitism that is linked to Israel hatred. I think, of course, our work is important, but I think we will have to convince the different French and European political interlocutors to explain how this new form of anti-Semitism related to Israel manifests itself, and therefore take the according consequences. So I think that will be whoever will win the next presidential elections, that will be an important issue, I think, that will have to be addressed.
Well, Simone and Anne-Sophie, thank you. First of all, congratulations on this really groundbreaking and unprecedented survey. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today, both on the surveys and your work beyond. We got a glimpse into larger geopolitical issues as well with the campaign. So really, thank you both for joining us. And I've seen firsthand the work that you do in France and in Europe. So really, I want to add my personal gratitude for all that you're doing on behalf of AJC. And with that, Claire, I'm going to circle back to you.
Thank you very much, Belle.
Thanks, Belle, Simone, and Anne-Sophie for today's really important conversation. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. To get involved and learn more about AJC's efforts to combat anti-Semitism, not only in France, but around the world, visit our new resource page at ajc.org/antisemitism resources. Thank you again, and goodbye.